Section 9 of Advice to Young Men and Boys. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Advice to Young Men and Boys by B Comegys. James Lawrence Claghorn. When a man has lived a long, busy, useful, and successful life, it seems proper that something more than the ordinary obituary notices in the daily papers is due to his memory. This thought moves me to speak to you today of a gentleman who died on August 25, 1884, while a director of the Girard College, and of whom it seems appropriate that something may be said to you in this chapel. Mr. James L. Claghorn was a distinguished citizen of Philadelphia. He was born here on the 5th of July, 1817. His father, John W. Claghorn, was a merchant of excellent standing, who, in the latter years of his life, gave much time and thought to benevolent institutions. At the age of 14 years, James left school to go into business. You boys know how very incomplete an education at school must be, which ends when the boy is 14 years old. But you don't know until your own experience proves it, how hard it is for a half-educated boy to compete for the high places in life or in business with boys of equal natural ability who have had the full advantage of a liberal school education. At 14, then, James Claghorn turned his back on school and went to work in earnest. For it was an auction store that he entered, and the work there was usually harder work than in other kinds of stores. The hours of labor were longer, earlier and later, and the holidays more rare than in ordinary commercial houses. There is no record of the early years of his business life, but it is not difficult to imagine the hardships to which a young lad of that time would be subjected. We can't suppose that any indulgence was allowed him because his father was one of the partners in the firm. Neither he nor his father would have permitted such distinction. The boy must have been industrious, for in such a house there was no place for an idle lounger. He was not afraid of work, for he was always at it. He did not spare himself, else some other boy would have done his share and got ahead of him. He must have been faithful, not one who works only when his master's eye is on him, not shirking any hard work, not forgetting today what he was told yesterday, not thinking too much of his rights or his own particular work, but doing anything that came to hand, looking always to the interest of the firm and trusting the future for a recognition of his faithfulness. And he must have been patient. Many rough words, many hasty and passionate words are spoken to young boys, and must have been spoken to this boy, and may have hurt him. But there is good reason to believe from the character he built up that he knew how to hold his tongue and not answer back. Not every boy has learned that useful lesson, and hence the many outbreaks of passion and the frequent discharge of boys who will answer back when they are reproved. And I think also that he must have been of a bright and cheery disposition and well-mannered. Some young fellows who have to make their way in the world seem not to know the importance of a good address. In other words, politeness, good breeding. Nothing impresses one so favorably at first meeting a stranger as good manners. A frank, hearty greeting, a bright, cheerful face, a manly bearing, a willingness to consider others, a desire to please for the sake of giving pleasure, are of great importance. On the contrary, sullenness, sluggishness, indifference, selfishness are all repulsive, and though allowance will be made at first for the existence of such qualities, yet they will hardly be tolerated long in a young person, and they will certainly unfit him for a successful career. I did not know Mr. Claghorn when he was a young lad, but I can hardly suppose that the kindly, genial, hearty man in middle and later life could have been a morose, sullen, sluggish, ill-mannered boy. I have said that Mr. Claghorn left school while still a boy, but we must not infer that he supposed his education was complete with the end of his school life, for it is very evident that he must have given very much of his leisure to self-improvement. We do not know how his evenings were spent when not in the counting-house, but he must have given a good deal of time to reading, and it is not likely that the books which he read were such as are to be found now at any book-stand and in the hands of so many boys as they go to and fro on their errands. Books which are simply read without instruction, and which sometimes treat of subjects which are unreal, extravagant, coarse, and brutalizing. Doubtless he was fond of fiction. All boys of fair education and refined taste are more or less fond of fiction. But we can hardly suppose that he gave too much of his time to such reading, else he could not have become the strong businessman that he was. At a very early age he became fond of art, and gathered about him, as his means would permit, engravings and pictures such as would cultivate his taste in that direction. When he could spare the money, he would buy an engraving, if the subject or author interested him, so that he became, in the latter part of his life, the owner of one of the largest collections of engravings in the whole country. Indeed, he became a noted patron of art, and especially was he desirous of encouraging native art, so that at one period he had more than 200 paintings, the work of American artists. For at that time he was more desirous of encouraging native artists, especially if they were poor, than he was in making collections of the great masters. Many a picture he bought to help the artist rather than for his own gratification as a collector. Further on in life, he became deeply interested in the Academy of the Fine Arts, which was then in Chestnut Street, above 10th. Subsequently, he became its president, and very largely through his influence and his personal means, that fine building at the southwest corner of Broad and Cherry Street, which all of you ought to visit as opportunity is afforded, was erected as a depository of art. The splendid building of the Academy of Music at Broad and Locust Street is also largely indebted to Mr. Claghorn for its erection. But I am anticipating, and we must now go back to Mr. Claghorn in his counting-house. No longer a boy, an apprentice, he has grown to manhood and has become a member of the firm, taking his father's place. Now his labors are greatly increased. The hours of business, which were long before, are longer now. He begins very early in the morning, before sunrise in the winter season, and is sometimes detained late in the evening, the long day being entirely devoted to business. And no one knows, except one who has gone through that sort of experience, how much labor is involved in such a life. But not only his labors, his responsibilities are greatly increased. He becomes the financial man in the firm. He is the head of the counting-house. He has charge of the books and the accounts. For many years no entry was made in the huge ledgers except in his own handwriting. The credit of the house of Myers and Claghorn becomes deservedly high. A time of great financial excitement and distress comes on. This house, while others are going down on the right and left like ships in a storm, stands erect with unimpaired credit, and with opportunities of helping other and weaker houses which so much needed help. The name of his firm was a synonym of all that is strong and admirable in business management. So he passed the best years of his whole life in earnest attention to business, snatching all the leisure he could for the gratification of his passion, it may be called, for art, until the time came when, having acquired what was at that time supposed to be an abundant competency, he determined to retire from business. Now he appears to contemplate a long rest and a visit to other countries, and was making arrangements looking to a long holiday of great enjoyment, when the country became involved in the Great Rebellion. None of you, except as you read it in history, know what a convulsion passed over the country when the first gun was fired upon the flag at Fort Sumter. Mr. Claghorn, full of love for his country and unwilling to do what seemed to him almost like a desertion in her time of trial, gave up his contemplated foreign tour, and applied himself most diligently and earnestly to the duties of a true, loyal citizen in the support of the government. He was one of the earliest members of the Union League, and was largely interested in collecting money for the raising and equipping of regiments to be sent to the front. 3 or 4 years of his life were spent in this laudable work, and in company with those of like mind he was largely instrumental in accomplishing great good. The war, however, came to an end, was fought out to its final and inevitable issue. Now the desire to visit foreign countries returned with increased interest. His business affairs, although they had not been as profitable as they would have been if he had looked closer to them and had given less thought to public matters during the war, were so satisfactory that he could afford to put them in other hands for a while, and in company with his wife he embarked for Europe. It was to be a long holiday, such as he had never known before. He intended to make an extended tour. He was not to be hurried. He went through England, Scotland, Ireland, France, Switzerland, Spain, Italy, Egypt, Palestine, Turkey, Greece, Austria, Russia, Germany, Holland, and Belgium. In this way he saw and enjoyed all the most famous picture galleries of the old world, and his long study of art in its various phases and schools gave him special advantages for the highest enjoyment of the great collections, public and private, of the old masters as well as those of modern times. The interest of his extended tour was not, however, limited to galleries and collections of paintings and statuary. He was an observer of men and things. His practical American mind observed and digested everything that came within his reach. The government of the great cities, the condition of the masses of the people gathered in them, the common people outside of the cities, their customs and costumes, their way of living. In short, everything that was unlike what we see at home, he observed and remembered to enjoy in the retrospect of after years. It was hardly to be expected that Mr. Claghorn, having lived the busy life that he had lived before he went abroad, should have been content on his return to sit down in the enjoyment of his well-earned leisure. And accordingly, shortly after his return, he became the president of the Commercial National Bank, one of the oldest financial institutions in our city. For several years previously, he had been a director in the Philadelphia National Bank, as his father had been before him, so that he had had proper training for the duties of his new position. He became also a manager in the Philadelphia Saving Fund Society, the oldest and the largest saving fund in our city. With most commendable diligence and industry, he at once set about building up the bank so as to make it profitable to its stockholders. Not forgetting, however, the attractions of art, he covered the walls of his bank parlor with beautiful specimens of the choicest engravings, so that even the daily routine of business life might be enlivened by glimpses into the attractive world of art. In the year 1869, when the Board of City Trusts was created by act of legislature, to which board is committed the vast estate left by Mr. Girard, as well as of the other trusts of the city of Philadelphia, Mr. Claghorn was appointed one of the original Board of 12, and from that date until his death, he gave much time and thought to the duties thus devolved upon him. He became chairman of the Finance Committee, which place he held until the end of his life. Although he was not so well known to the boys of the college as some other members of this board, because his duties did not require very frequent visits to the college, he nevertheless gave himself to the duties of the committee of which he was chairman with great interest and fidelity, and the time which he gave to this great work is not to be measured by visits to the college, but by the time spent in the city office and in his own place of business, where his committee met him on their stated meetings. As I have reason to know, he had a deep personal interest in all the affairs of this college and of the other trusts committed to our charge. Although the condition of his health in the latter part of his life made close attention to business very trying to him, so far as I know he never permitted his health to interfere with his business engagements. In this brief and fragmentary way, I have tried to set before you some features of the life of one of our most distinguished citizens. In the limits of a single discourse, as brief as this must be, it is not possible to make this more than an outline sketch. In the little time that remains, let me refer again, for the purpose of emphasis, to some traits in the character of Mr. Claghorn which will justly bear reconsideration. A very large proportion of the merchants of any city fail in business. The proportion is much larger than is generally known, and larger than young people are willing to believe. In an experience of more than 40 years of business life, during which I have had much to do with merchants, I have known so many failures, have seen so many wrecks of commercial houses, that I am compelled to regard a merchant who has maintained high credit for a long term of years and finally retired from business with a handsome estate, as one who is entitled to the respect and confidence of his fellow citizens. Some men grow rich as junior partners in successful business, the good management having been due to the ability and tact of their seniors, but this can hardly be said in the present case. The merchant whose life we are considering was an active and influential partner. Let me say, however, that true success in business is not to be measured by the amount of money one accumulates. A man may be rich in the riches acquired by his own activity and shrewdness, who is in no high sense a successful businessman. These things are necessary. He should be a just man, an upright, honorable man, a man of breadth and solidity of character, who gathers about him some of the ablest and best of his fellow citizens in labors for the good of others and the welfare of society. In such sense was Mr. Claghorn a successful businessman. His early love of art in its various forms, the substantial aid and encouragement he gave to young students in their beginnings, his deep sympathy with persons who in literature and art were striving for a living, his generous hospitality to artists, and his public spirit, all these had their influence in the growth and development of his character, and made his name to be loved and honored by many who shared in his generous sympathies. Mr. Claghorn's love of country, which we call patriotism, was signally disclosed at the outbreak of the war in 1861. When we remember his long and busy life as a merchant, broken by few or no vacations such as most other men enjoyed, when we remember that his self-culture had been of such a nature as to prepare him most admirably well for a tour in foreign countries, especially such countries as had produced the ablest, the most distinguished artists, we can have some idea of what it cost him to forego the much-needed rest, to deny himself the well-earned pleasure of a visit to the picture galleries of Europe, where are gathered the treasures of the highest art in all the world. Many men in like circumstances would have felt that one man whose age and sedentary habits unfitted him for active service in the field would hardly be missed from among the loyal citizens of the North. But he did not think so, and therefore he put aside all his personal plans, and in the city where he was born he remained, and devoted himself as one of her true, loyal citizens in raising money and men for the defense of the government. There could be no truer heroism than this, and right bravely and successfully he carried his purpose to the end. "I am permitted," said the clergyman who spoke at his funeral, and with his words I close these remarks, "I am permitted to address to you in the presence of the solemnity of death some few reflections that occur to me in memory of one whom we shall know no more in life. A few Saturday evenings ago, I was walking along by a lake at a seashore home when a great and wondrous beauty spread itself beneath my eye. It was one of those inimitable pictures that rarely come to one. In the foreground there lay a lake with no ripple on its surface. It was a calm and sleeping thing. A shining glory was in the western sky. The sun had gone, but where he disappeared were indications of beauty, one of the most beautiful afterglows I have ever seen. It was not one of the ordinary things, and as I looked at it there came many reflections. Here is one of them. it seems quite applicable this morning. That which caused the quiet glory of the lake, that which caused the radiation of beauty, had gone. Its day's work was done. That quiet lake and streaked sky were the type of a picture of a busy, useful, successful life that had been accomplished. It was a complete thing. The day was done. The activity had passed away. It was finished just as this life. What had made it beautiful had gone, but he flung back monuments of beauty that made the scene as beautiful as good words and noble deeds make the memory of man. There were 6 of those rays. Young men, brethren of this community, you will do well to remember that anywhere and everywhere, without patience and industry, nothing great can be done. The life departed was a busy one of busy usefulness. The cry that came from him was, "I must work, I must be busy." Live as this man did, that your life may be one that can be held up as an example and a light to young men of the coming generations. One ray of beauty was his sterling truthfulness. It is a splendid thing to be trusted by your fellows. Another ray was his prudent foresight. It was characteristic of him, and it is a splendid thing to have. Another ray that welled out of him was his striking humanity. There was one continual trait in his character. I would call it manhoodness. There was another feature, his deep humility. Such were some of the traits of character of a man who lived a long life in the city where he was born. If no distinctive monument has been erected to his memory, there are the Union League, the Academy of the Fine Arts, and the Academy of Music, with which his name will always be associated. And what is better still, there are many hearts that throb with grateful memories of an unselfish man, who in time of sore need stretched out his hand to help, and that hand was never empty. And you will remember, you Girard boys, that this man who did so much for his native city and for his fellow citizens was not nearly so well educated at the age of 14 when he left school as many of you are now. See what he did. See what some of you may do. End of section 9, read by John R. Moore, Albertville, Alabama, February 2023.